She fed a lonely boy every morning. Then the military showed up with a shocking message. Samantha Brooks, a 29-year-old waitress at Charlie's Diner, lived a life so quiet it almost seemed to vanish into the background of the small Kansas town she called home. Each morning, long before sunrise, she would tie her worn-out apron around her waist and head to work, offering warm smiles to the regulars who filled the diner's cracked leather booths. Beneath those smiles, though, was a loneliness she rarely let anyone see. Samantha had lost her father at 13 and her mother, just 2 years later, leaving her to grow up shuffling between distant relatives and small apartments that never quite felt like home. Now she lived alone above a dusty pharmacy, her walls decorated with fading photographs that only deepened the silence around her. Despite the routine, the long hours, and the aching gap left by the family she had lost, Samantha carried a quiet kindness inside her, the kind born from knowing exactly what it felt like to be unseen and forgotten. Every day was a mirror of the last. Early mornings, endless coffee pots, polite conversations that barely skimmed the surface. But somehow, even amid the sameness, she kept believing in small, unnoticed goodness. She had learned that you didn't need a big life to make a difference. Sometimes all it took was showing up, offering a smile, and carrying a bit of light into the lives of strangers passing through her little corner of the world. One crisp October morning, as the leaves scattered across the cracked sidewalks and the chill of early autumn slipped under the diner's old wooden door, Samantha first noticed him. A boy, maybe 10 years old at most, small for his age, with dark hair that flopped into watchful, wary eyes. He slipped into the farthest booth, the one tucked away near the window but hidden just enough to see the door. Without a word, he placed a battered backpack beside him and cracked open a thick, worn book, the spine so broken it barely held together. Samantha approached with her usual easy smile and asked if he wanted anything. He looked up for just a second, then quietly ordered only a glass of water, his voice so soft she had to lean in to catch it. She brought him the water with a straw and a napkin folded neatly beside it, and he nodded his thanks, almost imperceptibly, before burying himself back into the world of his book. The next morning, he was there again. Same booth, same book, same order, just a glass of water. No food, no questions. Samantha watched him from behind the counter, her curiosity tugging quietly at her heart. Day after day, it became a silent routine. At precisely 7:15 every morning, he would slip into the diner, settle into the same seat, and read, as if trying to disappear into the pages. Other customers came and went, farmers, factory workers, retirees nursing coffee over the morning paper, but the boy remained a constant presence, untouched by the hustle around him. He never made a scene, never drew attention to himself, and never ordered anything beyond that single, simple glass of water. Samantha couldn't help but notice the way his eyes flicked to the plates of pancakes, the sizzling bacon, the golden stacks of toast passing by his table. He never asked, never begged, just watched with a look that was too old for a boy so young, a mixture of hunger and restraint, as if he had long since learned not to expect kindness from strangers. As the mornings grew colder and the sun later to rise, Samantha found herself instinctively glancing toward the door at exactly 7:15, feeling a subtle lift in her chest when she saw him enter. There was something haunting about his presence, something that called to a part of her that remembered what it was like to sit in the corner of a room and feel invisible. Though they exchanged only the briefest of words, water, please, and thank you, an unspoken thread began to weave between them, delicate and fragile. Samantha didn't know his name, didn't know where he came from or why he always sat alone, but she knew this much. He carried loneliness like a second backpack and hunger like a second skin. And even though he never said so, Samantha could see it in the way he held his body, guarded and tense, always half ready to run. She didn't know yet how much that silent boy would change her life. But something deep inside her already understood. When the heart recognizes another wounded soul, it doesn't need an invitation to care. It was on the 15th morning that Samantha decided to do something she hadn't planned. As the boy sat in his usual booth, his book open and his glass of water half empty, She approached with a plate of pancakes balanced carefully in her hands. Setting it down in front of him, she put on a puzzled expression and said, "The kitchen made an extra order by mistake. I figured it would be a shame to waste it." The boy looked up at her, suspicion flickering across his face, his eyes darting between her and the plate like he was trying to spot the trap hidden beneath the syrup. Samantha gave a small shrug and an easy smile, as if it were no big deal, then walked away before he could object, returning to her post behind the counter but watching discreetly from the corner of her eye. For a long moment, the boy simply stared at the food, unmoving, the tension in his small frame almost painful to witness. But slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached for the fork and took a tentative bite. When she came by to clear the table half an hour later, the plate was spotless, not a crumb left behind, and the boy mumbled a barely audible "thank you," his eyes glued to the battered book in front of him. The next morning, Samantha repeated the trick, this time bringing scrambled eggs and toast. Again, she pretended it was an accident, a kitchen mix-up, something casual and meaningless. And again, the boy hesitated before giving in to the temptation he could no longer fight. It became a quiet ritual between them, one without acknowledgement or conversation. Samantha never asked him why he was always alone, why he never ordered food for himself, or where his parents might be. She understood instinctively that questions would only push him away, tear down the fragile trust that was slowly, painfully, being built one plate at a time. Some days it was oatmeal with brown sugar. Other days it was a modest stack of pancakes or a simple grilled cheese sandwich. Always warm, always delivered with the same casual nonchalance, as if Samantha had no idea he needed it, as if the universe itself had simply placed an extra meal on the table and she was merely the messenger. The boy never looked directly at her when he ate. His focus remained on his book, his shoulders tense at first, but gradually, imperceptibly, relaxing a little more each morning. Each quiet "thank you," he whispered after finishing, was so soft that Samantha sometimes had to lean in to hear it. But it was enough. She never needed more. There was a kind of dignity in the way he accepted the food without begging for it, and Samantha was determined to honor that dignity. She had no grand plan, no mission to save the world, no expectation of gratitude or recognition. She just knew, in the deepest part of herself, that sometimes kindness didn't need a reason or a reward. It just needed to exist, quietly, steadily, in the spaces where loneliness and hunger lived. As the weeks passed, and the boy's silent presence became a familiar part of the morning rhythm at Charlie's Diner, not everyone remained quietly tolerant. Samantha noticed the glances first, the way a few regulars would nudge each other when she placed another accidental plate of food in front of the boy, pretending not to see their smirks. Whispers floated across the counter, as if they thought she couldn't hear them. "Playing charity worker now, huh?" One of the older men muttered one morning, swirling the last of his coffee in the chipped mug. Another customer, a middle-aged woman who never smiled unless she was gossiping, leaned toward her friend and said with a sharp laugh, "Kids these days think the world owes them. That waitress is just making it worse, giving him free handouts." Samantha kept her face neutral, refusing to let their words leave a mark on the surface. But inside, she felt the sting of their judgment like small, sharp stones. Still, she didn't stop. Every morning, she prepared a plate and brought it to the boy's booth with the same casual grace, making sure he never felt like a burden. However, it wasn't long before the whispers turned into complaints. One afternoon, as the lunch crowd thinned and the clatter of dishes settled into a low hum, Mark, the diner's manager, called Samantha into the back office. Mark was a practical man, a former trucker with a permanent sheen of sweat on his brow and a mind that counted pennies faster than Samantha could blink. As she stepped into the cramped office, she immediately noticed the tension in his posture, the way he drummed his thick fingers against the laminate desk. "Sam," he began, sighing heavily, "I've been watching you with that kid." Samantha said nothing, just waited, her hands twisting the frayed hem of her apron. "You can't keep giving away food like that," he continued, his voice more tired than angry. "It's bad for business. Sets a precedent. Customers notice, They start thinking they can ask for free meals too. Word gets around, and before you know it, we're running a soup kitchen, not a diner. Samantha met his gaze steadily, her heart thudding in her chest. "I'll pay for it," she said simply. Mark blinked, caught off guard. "From your tips?" "Sam, that barely covers your rent, let alone groceries or—" "It's my choice," she interrupted, her voice low but firm. "Just one meal a day. I can manage." For a moment, it looked like he would argue, but then he let out another long sigh and rubbed the back of his neck. "Fine," he said, though his tone carried no enthusiasm. "But if it affects your work, or if there's any trouble, it stops." "Understood." Samantha nodded, a wave of relief washing over her. She had braced herself for worse, for a warning, maybe even termination, but this compromise, however uneasy, she could live with. From that day on, Samantha set aside a portion of her tips every shift, folding small bills and coins into a worn envelope she kept tucked in her apron pocket. Money that could have gone toward a new coat for the brutal Kansas winter or a long overdue trip to the dentist now quietly funded a boy's simple breakfasts. She never second-guessed the decision. Each morning, when she saw him walk through the door, a little less hunched, a little more willing to meet her gaze, Samantha knew she had made the right choice. But the murmurs didn't stop. Some customers continued to make snide remarks under their breath, muttering about strays and soft-hearted fools, their words dripping with the bitterness of those who had long forgotten what it meant to need a helping hand. Even a few of her co-workers looked at her sideways now and then, shaking their heads as if Samantha was a naive child who would soon learn a hard lesson. Only a few offered silent, understanding nods, people who had, at some point, stood on the thin edge of desperation themselves. Samantha carried on without responding to the criticisms. She had learned a long time ago that defending kindness only hardened the hearts of those determined not to understand. She didn't feed the boy for praise or validation. She did it because she recognized in him the same gnawing hunger she had once known, the kind that went deeper than the stomach, the kind that settled into the bones when the world taught you too early not to expect anything from anyone. And so, every morning, with quiet determination, Samantha continued her small rebellion against indifference, armed only with a plate of warm food, a steady hand, and a heart that refused to close itself off to another soul in need. For more than 2 months, every morning at precisely 7:15, the boy had been there, slipping quietly into his usual booth at Charlie's Diner, burying himself in his worn book and silently accepting the warm plate Samantha always brought without question. It had become part of her rhythm, a thread woven so deeply into her days that she barely had to think about it anymore. But then, one particularly bitter Thursday morning in early December, he didn't show. At first, Samantha brushed it off. Maybe he was sick, maybe the cold had kept him home, maybe there was a field trip or some school event she didn't know about. She kept glancing at the door every few minutes, an anxious flutter building in her chest, but the booth stayed empty, the minutes slipping by until it was 8 o'clock and the diner's morning rush swallowed up her worries. Still, something gnawed at her, a quiet unease she couldn't shake. She wrapped his usual plate of pancakes carefully and tucked it behind the counter, just in case. The next morning, the boy was absent again, and the next. Samantha continued to prepare a plate each day, setting it down at his empty booth with a stubborn kind of hope, even as the food grew cold and untouched. Kathy, who manned the grill with a permanent frown, shook her head every time she walked past. "Told you," she muttered under her breath one day. "Strays never stick around once the handouts dry up." Samantha didn't respond. She couldn't explain the hollow space the boy's absence carved into her mornings, how the sight of that empty booth seemed to dim the whole diner. She hadn't known much about him. Not his name, not his story, but somehow his silent presence had mattered, and now the emptiness he left behind weighed heavier than she ever expected. Around the 5th day, the murmurs started again. A woman from a neighboring town, someone Samantha barely recognized, came in for coffee and whispered too loudly to her friend about how she'd seen pictures online. Confused, Samantha finished her shift and, once home, opened her old laptop to find out what they were talking about. Her heart sank. Someone had taken a picture of the empty booth, the plate of untouched pancakes, and posted it in a local Facebook group, captioned with cruel sarcasm, "Rosie's Diner, now serving imaginary charity cases." The comments below were even worse. People mocked the idea of a kid who vanished once the free meals were gone. Some accused the diner of staging the whole thing as a publicity stunt. Others were harsher, warning against feeding strays and creating dependency. They didn't know. They hadn't seen the cautious gratitude in the boy's lowered eyes, hadn't noticed the way he devoured the food like he was afraid it might disappear, hadn't felt the unspoken trust that had slowly, painstakingly grown between them. Samantha sat staring at the screen long after the comments blurred into a meaningless sea of words. She wasn't someone who usually let public opinion sway her, but tonight, alone in her tiny apartment above the pharmacy, she felt the sting of it, sharp and humiliating. Had she been foolish? Naive? Had she projected her own loneliness onto a stranger who never asked for her help? Doubts crept in where hope had once lived. That night, searching for comfort, Samantha pulled out the small wooden box she kept tucked away in her closet, the one filled with memories of her parents. Inside, she found an old photograph of her father, smiling in his army uniform, and a tattered journal he had carried through his deployment. She flipped through the fragile pages until she found the familiar entry, the one she had read 100 times before. "Shared half my ration with a local boy today. Johnson said I was crazy, that he might betray us. Maybe he's right, but hunger's the same everywhere. It doesn't care about sides. No one grows poor by sharing half a loaf." Samantha ran her fingers over the faded ink, a fierce warmth building in her chest. No one grows poor by sharing half a loaf. Her father had believed that, and she still believed it too, no matter how loudly the world sneered. The boy's absence hurt. The mockery stung. But she would not regret giving kindness freely. Some things didn't need a thank you to be worthwhile. They just needed to be done. The next morning, she still prepared the plate. She still set it down at the empty booth. And even though the boy might never return, Samantha decided she would continue to make space for hope, for dignity, and for unseen acts of compassion that didn't need the world approval to matter. It was a quiet Wednesday morning, the kind where the winter air pressed against the windows and the world moved a little slower when everything changed. Samantha was refilling coffee at the counter when she noticed something unusual through the frosted glass. Four large black SUVs pulling into the diner's tiny, cracked parking lot. Their polished surfaces gleamed under the dull gray sky, and the government plates caught the morning light just enough to turn every head inside the diner. The vehicles moved in careful, choreographed precision, forming a semicircle at the entrance. Conversation inside the diner died instantly. Forks paused midair, coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Samantha felt her heart pound in her ears as the driver's doors opened almost simultaneously and uniformed men stepped out, their postures stiff and formal, standing guard by their vehicles. From the lead SUV, a tall man with a weathered face and a chest full of medals stepped forward, his dress uniform immaculate despite the dust of the roadside parking lot. He scanned the diner's worn facade with a soldier's sharp, assessing gaze, then strode purposefully toward the door, flanked by two younger officers. The bell above the door gave a small, almost apologetic chime as they entered, the sound somehow thunderous in the thick silence that filled the room. Mark, the manager, emerged from the kitchen, his face pale, his tie crooked from the rush to look presentable. Can I help you, gentlemen?" he stammered. The senior officer removed his cap and tucked it neatly under his arm. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and calm. "I'm looking for Samantha Brooks," he said. Every eye in the diner swung to Samantha, who stood frozen behind the counter, a coffee pot still in her hand. She set it down carefully, trying to steady her hands, and stepped forward. "I'm Samantha," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. The man gave her a small, respectful nod. "My name is Colonel David Reeves, United States Army Special Forces Command," he said, reaching into his breast pocket and pulling out a crisp, white envelope sealed with a military insignia. "I'm here on behalf of Master Sergeant James Taylor and his family." Samantha blinked, confusion blooming in her chest. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I don't understand." Colonel Reeves's expression softened, just a fraction. "You have been helping someone very important to us," he said. "You may not have known his name, but the boy you've been feeding, the boy who sat quietly in that booth every morning, is Adam Taylor. His father, Master Sergeant Taylor, was deployed overseas on a classified operation. During that time, Adam's mother abandoned him. He was too scared, too proud, and too loyal to tell anyone. He survived on the small emergency fund his father left behind, stretching meals however he could. And every morning, he found a place here with you." Samantha felt the room tilt slightly, as if the floor had shifted under her feet. Adam. His name was Adam, and he had been completely alone. Colonel Reeves continued, his voice low but steady. "Master Sergeant Taylor fell in Afghanistan 2 months ago. In his final letter to our command, he wrote very specifically, if anything were to happen to him, we were to find the woman who fed his son, the woman who gave kindness without asking for anything in return, and deliver his gratitude." Samantha stared at the envelope in his hand, unable to move. The colonel gently extended it toward her. "This is a letter from Sergeant Taylor, and a personal message from all of us who served alongside him. We wanted you to know you didn't just feed a hungry child. You preserved the dignity of a soldier's son when he needed it most." Tears blurred Samantha's vision as she took the envelope with trembling fingers. Around her, the diner remained utterly still, the regulars and staff too moved to speak. Colonel Reeves straightened his posture, then in a gesture rare and deeply meaningful, snapped to attention and rendered a formal military salute directly to her. Every soldier inside and outside the diner followed, standing rigid, saluting in perfect unison, honoring the waitress who had quietly changed a life without ever knowing it. Samantha clutched the letter to her chest, overwhelmed by the realization that her small, unnoticed acts of kindness had rippled further than she could have ever imagined. She hadn't just offered a boy a plate of pancakes or scrambled eggs. She had offered him hope, respect, and a place to belong at a time when he had no one else. And now, standing amid a room full of strangers who suddenly understood, Samantha realized that kindness, real, quiet, unconditional kindness, was never wasted. Not ever. The days that followed Colonel Reeves' visit were unlike anything Samantha Brooks had ever experienced. Word of what had happened inside Charlie's diner that cold winter morning spread through town faster than the chill of December air. At first, it was just whispers among the regulars. Old farmers leaning over their coffee cups, young mothers exchanging glances at the counter. But by the end of the week, the local newspaper had picked up the story. A reporter who had once scoffed at the idea of covering anything outside of politics now sat at one of Samantha's booths, scribbling furiously into a worn notepad as she tried to capture the heart of a story too big to fit neatly between headlines. The article ran the next morning. Waitress's quiet kindness honors fallen soldier's son. By noon, the diner was packed. Veterans wearing faded unit patches and old campaign hats showed up just to shake Samantha's hand. Strangers from neighboring towns drove in, leaving generous tips and small handwritten notes tucked beneath their plates. Notes that simply said things like, "Thank you for reminding us," or "You make me believe again." Soldiers passing through Kansas on their way to new assignments began making detours just to sit in the little booth where Adam had once quietly read his book. Some left behind small tokens, unit coins, patches, sometimes even medals, which Mark, the diner's gruff but newly softened manager, started pinning to a corkboard behind the counter. Within weeks, that board became a vibrant, living collage of gratitude from across the country. The same Facebook group that once mocked Samantha's actions now flooded with comments of admiration. Photos of the diner's simple booze and worn floors were shared thousands of times, alongside retellings of Master Sergeant Taylor's final letter and Adam's silent resilience. For once, the voices that had jeered and judged were drowned out by something stronger, respect, appreciation, and a deep, aching pride that someone like Samantha still existed in a world too often hardened by cynicism. Mark, moved in a way he couldn't quite articulate, made a decision he hadn't thought possible even a month earlier. One snowy evening, after the last customers had trickled out and Samantha was wiping down the counter, he called her over with an awkward cough. In the front window of the diner, where faded holiday decorations still clung stubbornly to the glass, Mark taped up a new sign. It was simple, just a piece of wood painted navy blue with white block letters that read, "Whoever you are, however little you can pay, no one leaves hungry." Samantha stared at it for a long moment, the rag dangling forgotten from her hand. When she finally turned to Mark, she saw him watching her, embarrassment warring with a rough kind of pride. "Figured it was time," he said, shrugging like it was no big deal. But Samantha knew better. She understood that kind of quiet courage, the bravery it took to shift a hardened heart, to open a door wider instead of slamming it shut. From that day forward, Charlie's Diner wasn't just a place to grab breakfast or slice a pie. It became something more, a refuge, a haven for the weary and the struggling. Families who had lost soldiers overseas, veterans who had fallen on hard times, single parents working 2 jobs just to stay afloat. They all found their way to Samantha's little corner of the world. And no one ever left hungry. Sometimes, when Samantha served a steaming plate of pancakes or slid a cup of hot coffee in front of someone whose eyes carried the heavy weight of unseen battles, she caught the faintest glimpse of Adam's shy smile reflected in their gratitude. It reminded her that kindness was never a waste, no matter how invisible it sometimes felt. She didn't do interviews or pose for pictures. She didn't hang medals or letters on the walls for show. The letter from Master Sergeant Taylor remained tucked in her apron